Hello and welcome once again to the Pocono Liars Club Zoom chat. This week we're going to have some very nice guests. We have Leslie Penelope and Gail Martin, and we're going to talk about romance writing. So let's start by introducing everybody. Leslie, say hi.
Hi, I'm Leslie. I write as Penelope, and I write mainly fantasy and paranormal romance. My first series is Ursinger Chronicles, which is epic fantasy with a lot of romance in it.
Which is why I asked you to be here.
Right.
Gail?
Hi, I'm Gail Z Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Morgan Bryce, as Gail Z Martin, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more. And as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. And all of my Gail stuff is about 99% action, but there's still that 1 or 2% of romance because, you know, you can't fight all the time.
Let's first talk about the difference between a romance novel and a story that has romance in it. A romance novel has more strict restrictions. Is that true?
Yes. Generally with romance, the main storyline is the couple getting together and whether or not they will get together. Now with paranormal, when you get into the subgenres, you have a lot, the percentage shifts a little bit. So if you had, say, a contemporary romance, the entire storyline is will they or won't they? And there might be some other external conflicts. But a paranormal or a fantasy romance, you'll have those more battles, more fighting, more external conflict, but a very strong through line is still the romance. And then romance also has to have a happily ever after or a happy for now at the end.
Yeah, and that's really one of the big things is the romance has to have a happily ever after or happily for now. So you can throw all kinds of stuff at them. They can have this this sort of breakup moment at 80% where you think all is lost, but in the end, they have to be together at least for now. So and that's not a restriction that you have in other genres where you have a romantic subplot.
Now, both of you have you both written romance novels as well as putting stories into it? I think both of you have done that, right?
Yeah.
Well,
go on.
Pardon me. My urban fantasy paranormal romance, I would say, is about 50% urban fantasy, 50% romance. So you were talking about having, the other conflicts as well. It's not just about getting the people together. They're also usually, vampires, werewolves, bad witches, other stuff to fight as they decide they fall in love.
But it's still marketed as a romance, a paranormal romance.
Yes, and it's still probably about 50% of the book is inside their head. Does he, doesn't he, will he, won't he, am I not, is this the right thing to do? Much more internal dialogue than my epic fantasy sword and sorcery people.
Leslie, you agree?
Yeah, so I have two series. One is being marketed as adult fantasy. When I originally wrote it, I was thinking it would be more fantasy romance. And, the content is the same. So the marketing is based on the publisher's desire to market it. And then my self-published series is paranormal romance by design. And it's still, I probably maybe 60% romance, between 50 and 60%, I would say, for the paranormal romance. And then as, epic fantasy, I have generally one couple per book, but I also have other point of view characters. So the actual romantic thread is a lot smaller, even though it's still very important for the plot of the book.
Well, it's important for the character development, but that's not the plot. The plot isn't just are they going to get together.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, there's a ton of other external conflicts happening.
Do you feel still required to make the characters get back together at the end, or do you think that's not as much of a guideline when you're doing the non-romantic books?
I mean, I think it's personal choice, but if you're going to appeal to the romance reader, who can be very specific, even if they like the fantasy, they want the magic, they want the paranormal elements, they're still going to want the strong romance and the happily ever after. That's definitely what they're looking for. So that kind of separates it from maybe an urban fantasy where you might have a love interest and then maybe the character sleeps with other people and they come back. That is a romantic subplot, but not a romance.
Yeah, and in mine, I tend to do a lot with established couples. So once you get them together, then they continue to build their relationship. And as anybody who's been in a relationship knows, that doesn't mean it suddenly gets boring and it's a coast from there on in. That's when the hard work starts. The falling in love part's, easy by comparison. Building a relationship while you're also fighting werewolves, that's tougher.
Right.
So mine tend to have that drama in the first book about getting together, and then they run into new sources of drama and evolution as people and as a couple. And that's true on both my Gail stuff and the first 4 series of my Morgan Bryce stuff. Now, the new series that's coming out next month is going to be a different couple every book. They're also shifters. It's kind of different thing.
Shifters?
Shifters, yes. The first book has a wolf shifter and a fox shifter, fated mates.
Of course. And I've read both of your books. I've read books by both of you, I should say. And the romance that I've noticed in both of your books isn't obvious from the beginning. In other words, you meet the characters, but you don't know they're going to get together. And at the end, it starts to become a little more obvious. You don't start off with them getting together and then building the romance. But maybe that I'm only getting a partial feel because I haven't read everything you guys have written, admittedly.
I think for me, I try to do that because I'm writing fantasy, and even in the paranormal romance, it's probably a little bit more clear because it is a slightly different audience. But it's really important to me, like it's more interesting to me to write about other things and then have them fall in love along the way. But it really is reader and audience dependent. It's kind of like, who are you targeting the book toward, and what do they expect? What are they really looking for? Because like I said, romance readers, they can be very vocal, and they can be very specific about what they want to see and what they don't want to see. And there's not always agreement. Some people have a higher tolerance for some things and pet peeves and all of that. But like as a romance reader myself, the things that I tend to want to see are what I try to put into the books.
Yeah, with the Gail stuff, which is the epic and the urban, I really love established couples and evolving relationships, and I also really love the whole friends to lovers thing. So in the books that are series, a lot of times you'll see that friends to lovers piece where a secondary character will show up and they'll start to become a dependent on ally, or they'll play an important part in the role, and then down the line the romance blossoms, because the romance isn't the key feature, but you want to present a well-rounded character that actually seems real and isn't just one-dimensional talking about killing things. On the Morgan side, where it's definitely romance, I think it's pretty clear from the beginning of the book who the two people are going to be that fall in love, mostly because I tend to do 2 point of view characters. So who else would they be?
Yes.
kind of drops it. Then that isn't really the mystery. The mystery is, well, how do they get together? What brings them together, not who is going to get together, if that kind of makes sense.
And also, if there's a conflict where you think they can't possibly get together, how can they overcome this thing that, their clans are at war, or whatever your conflict is? That's kind of the fun of reading it too.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually going to be my next question, because I noticed that in both of your books that I'm thinking of, the Necromancer series and your series, Leslie, was that they were not just, you wrote it in a way that they could not get together because there's going to be some political reason, if nothing else, that's going to be in their way, that's going to stand in their way. And that makes it a lot more interesting than just, people getting together. It gives you plot, right?
Right, yeah. And that's why I don't tend to write like contemporary romances, because the conflict is just more difficult to create well in a modern situation. What really prevents 2 people from getting together? It's harder to come up with something that's organic and not forced or kind of silly. I mean, it's fine if it's silly. Some books are silly, but it's I think it's easier when you have magic and creatures and blood feuds or fated mates or something like that. It gives you more to explore.
Yeah, for the contemporary ones where something forces people apart, usually those are when it's something that isn't just people having amazing misunderstandings. It's that there's somebody's an assassin and somebody's FBI and they fall in love, and how could they, where they're solving a mystery, they're solving a case, there's some law enforcement element, somebody's trying to kill them. Maybe it's just where I am in life, but I really don't have time to watch people who can't find their way out of a paper bag. So when when the conflict feels forced or just unnatural, or you want to slap them, that takes me out of the story as a reader, because it's too easily fixed. Unless you give them a reason, like they're young, okay, I'll buy it. If they're 20 and 21, they don't know how to talk. But when you get to people who are in their 30s and they aren't using their words,
Right.
I'm a lot less patient. And
Certainly.
I tend to write that way because that's what drives me nuts sometimes, is when you just want to yell at the characters. I want to sit you both down, use my mom voice, and tell you to work this out.
I've seen too many romantic movies that are like that, where all they need to do is say one word and it solves the problem. But for the plot, they don't do it. And that is a cheap way out, if you ask me. Let me go back and ask a basic question, though, to make sure we can talk about the right things. What's the difference between romance, erotica, and pornography? Is there a line, or is it all gray areas?
Well, I'll give you my 30-second definition. Romance is the whole story is about getting the two people to fall in love. Erotica, the whole story is about getting the people to go to bed. And porn is when you call the plumber or the pizza man and things take their course from there.
Yeah, I think that so there's all different subgenres within romance, and there's erotica and then erotic romance, which are actually separate things. And so, yeah, like she said, the romance is about the whole, usually there's a character arc. I mean, there almost has to be a character arc. It's very important in romance to each character is going through something, and there's usually a strong internal conflict in addition to an external conflict, even if it's a simple external conflict. So erotica tends to be how this relationship, or erotic romance, let's say erotic romance is a romance where the relationship really grows because of the sexual relationship. So it's actually important there's still a character arc, there's still a growth of the relationship, but sex is just important to that growth. And then erotica is further on the spectrum, where maybe there's less change in growth and just more sex on the page. And, pornography is at the very end of the spectrum. Like, it doesn't have to be a story. There's no characters per se. It's just for titillation.
As the Supreme Justice said, you know it when you see it.
That's right. It's hard to define it exactly. Is there any difference when writing gay or lesbian romance from when you write a heterosexual romance? Does it seem to, plot-wise, have you found any differences?
No, I think I try to be very upfront with my characters who are gay men about some of the challenges that they will have faced in their lives and perhaps in their surrounding that hetero couples don't have to worry about. If you're a straight couple and you want to reach over and take your partner's hand, you can pretty much do that just about everywhere, and nobody is going to look twice at you. You might calculate that a lot more if you're a gay couple. So I think that factors in, but the whole, for me, love is love. And so the emotions and the affection, regardless of the mechanics or who's involved and what their equipment is, all kind of works the same way.
Yeah, I don't write gay romance. I have, characters, all kinds of characters, queer characters in the story. But from what I've read, it's definitely the conflicts can be, you can use that as a source of conflict. But we're getting to a time when you don't have to do that, and it can just be just like any other romance, and you don't have to deal with, you can be in a very accepting environment without any sort of homophobia. And those kinds of stories are great to tell too. Just two gay people, normal, regular, nobody's, coming for them, and they can just tell their love story too.
What's the audience like? I mean, is it mostly women, men, age? What do you find?
According to RWA statistics, I think romance readers are 80% women, and is a higher preponderance in like the 30 to 55 age range, slightly. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of younger women and, men and everyone who's reading it, but I think those are the strongest demographics.
Well, and it's interesting with gay romance, which is a really growing field, and a significant percentage of readers, and I don't know the numbers per se, but it's pretty well split between gay male readers and middle-aged cis or het women. And there are there's a lot of discussion on why that is and why that is attractive. And I think a lot of it comes down to you have two characters who begin with equal privilege. So you don't have to sort out the issue of privilege in the relationship. You start with two people who have equal privilege.
I'm going to ask you each to talk about one of your books, pick which one you want to talk about, and tell us how you made your romance believable to the reader so that it didn't look like it was just pieced together for plot reasons. You know, how did you make it so that you didn't read it and go, oh, that why is this person with this person? You know, how did you do that? Leslie, just any one of your books.
So Song of Blood and Stone is the first book in the Earthsinger Chronicles, which is my epic fantasy.
The one I read.
And I knew I wanted to have star-crossed lovers. When I sold it to St. Martin's Press, the original tagline was Romeo and Juliet meets Return of the King, which it is a romance. So Romeo and Juliet is not a romance, but people use it that way because you understand what it means when they say that. And so both of the characters are on a journey, but they meet each other at the beginning in sort of a moment of crisis. And the heroine saves the hero's life when he's been taken captive as a spy. And so sort of the beginning of the relationship is working through this crisis and trying to survive together. And I think that's, you know, fertile ground for a relationship to form. And through all the trials and tribulations, they get closer and closer together, even though they are star-crossed lovers and they really should not be together. So it was both integral to the story, but it's not the plot of the story because there's a whole other arc about stopping a war from happening and awakening a sleeping goddess. And, you know, there's these two countries that have been at war for hundreds of years, and they're star-crossed lovers because they're each on different sides of that. So because I love romance so much and adding the fantasy into it, it feels like it's easier to make it so that it's, you know, integrated and it's just another part of it. Because there's a long history of romance in fantasy. I mean, I think possibly the majority of fantasy has some level of romance in it. And it's just, it's the level. It's like, how much are you including?
And what I liked about that book was the fact that they were from different worlds, and once more there was that border between them saying you really shouldn't be together, and people around them saying, why are you with this person? And, you know, that added an extra level, I thought. Made it more believable, honestly, you know, because that happens sometimes.
Right.
Neil?
Well, you know, one of the things that I think made it easier for me to, easy for me to kind of move over into doing the urban fantasy romance is, in my head when I was writing the less romantic fantasy, I always knew that there was more stuff that happened off camera and off page. We just didn't put it in because it would have detracted from the plot and the pacing, but you know it happens. So with the romance, you now have the leeway, the permission to draw the camera back out and show those parts that you would have skipped over, summarized, or left out, and make that more of a focus. So it isn't so much adding things as showing what was always there. Mm-hmm. And in my Badlands series is set in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and you've got a psychic medium. So he gets visions and he can see ghosts. And you have a very skeptical homicide detective. And the meet cute at the beginning is standing in line at the coffee shop waiting in a long line, and it's raining outside and they're stuck inside. So they have a nice conversation, which gets interrupted because he gets a call from work and disappears. And the psychic, Simon, thinks he's never probably going to see him again. So he goes back to his shop on the boardwalk where he does ghost tours and sells merchandise and does psychic readings. And somebody comes in. And lo and behold, it's the cop who has reached a dead end on a murder investigation. There's a serial killer and they can't figure out what's going on. And he's got his back against the wall, so he figures, well, what the heck, I'll ask the psychic, although he doesn't believe in psychics. And oh my God, it's the cute guy from the coffee shop. So now there's kind of this tension. They like each other, but I don't really trust you. And the problem is Simon keeps getting visions and clues from ghosts about stuff in the investigation he shouldn't know about. He tries to do the right thing and tell Vic this stuff to help Vic with his investigation. But Vic, who had a run-in with the supernatural, lost a job over it, and he's really touchy about the whole thing, really doesn't want to go down that track again. And so how can you help but see Simon as a suspect because he knows this stuff and he shouldn't know this stuff, even though Vic really wants to believe him and thinks he's kind of falling for the guy. And then Simon finds a body. And oh my gosh, how are you going to get him out of this? Well, as it turns out, since all my urban fantasy series cross over, the high-powered lawyer from Deadly Curiosities shows up to bail the guy out after a mutual friend calls him, gets Simon out of jail. But then Simon no longer trusts Vic. Vic knows he's really screwed up bad. And Simon figures out who the killer is. And he figures out the killer is using magic. So if he tells the cops and the cops go after the killer, the cops are going to get slaughtered. So Simon knows he's got to do this himself. And of course, he leaves a note. And then, you know, it all blows up beautifully. People nearly die. There are near deathbed confessions of love. And, you know, Simon and Vic decide that they're meant for each other.
But what's interesting is that there is, what you've just described to me is a story that just has romance in it. It's not, and that's the point, you know, you're not just writing people getting together and having arguments and are they going to get together and are they not going to get together, which seems to me more a romance novel than a more cliche romance novel, I should say.
And there's a fair amount, you know, what I left out of that was the heartache and the angsting of, I really like this guy. I wish he trusted me. Oh, I wish I could tell him. Is he lying to me? Is he not lying to me? You know, there was a fair amount of that I left out of the summary.
You mentioned a meet cute, and that's a phrase that I've heard mostly with movies when I first heard it years and years ago. So let's describe that. Can you define that for those who might not know what that term means? Either one.
Meet cute is basically when the two love interests meet, the first meeting that they have. And so in terms of a romance novel, you know, it's that in the structure of things, usually it's the inciting incident of at least the romance plot, because if they hadn't met, nothing else would happen. So it can be an important plot point, and you try to make it like a set piece. You try to make it as interesting and memorable as possible because it's the beginning of that journey.
Yeah, if it's a Hallmark movie type book, then, you know, somebody walks out of a store, slips on the ice, nearly falls, but the other person catches them and, you know, oh my, I feel like such a fool. That's kind of a very well-worn trope. But the cute part of it doesn't always have to be cute. Sometimes if it's an enemies to lovers thing, you see the initial clash where, oh my gosh, the cute guy is going to be the prosecuting attorney and I can't stand that guy. So it just has to be, like she said, the inciting incident that throws the sparks up and goes, okay, here are the two people. Let's see how they work this out.
One thing I've seen a lot of in romance movies more than books, since I honestly have not read that many romance books, is the idea of what we might today consider stalking, where, you know, the guy meets this girl and she's not interested in him, but he does all these cute things, and little by little he wins her over, and by the end they're happy and married, which by today's standards or by any standards would be, you know, if you actually did that, you'd probably be arrested for harassment. How do you avoid that? How do you write that to make it work without it making it seem like you're a stalker?
I think that it's important to remember that, like, that romance is large part about the fantasy of falling in love, and that a lot of the things that you see in popular romance tropes are not necessarily things that you would want to have happen in real life, but they work on the page and they work for the readers of that genre. And so, yeah, like you've got your Twilight situation where Edward was sneaking into Bella's bedroom and then watching her sleep, and that's a common trope, the watching you sleep trope, especially if you're a 100-year-old vampire. You know, you see that over and over again. And yeah, in real life, not so great, but in fiction, it's all a part of the fantasy of it, and it's thought of as, I guess, romantic. But I think, yeah, there's that kind of cognitive dissonance of the things that you would actually want to have happen to you, and consent and agency and all of those things. And I think some of the criticism of romance is that it can do away with those things, but with the acknowledgement that this is about the fantasy of falling in love, and we're not talking about real life.
And for me, that's honestly one of the things that attracted me to reading male-male romance as opposed to male-female romance, because the tropes are different. And as I said, you start out with two characters who are equal in agency and equal in privilege. So by virtue of both being male. And so you don't have to sort out, oh my, isn't she plucky because she's independent? Of course he's plucky and independent. He's a guy. You can skate past that whole thing. And so a lot of those problematic tropes really aren't an issue. Not that there aren't tropes in male-male romance, and not that you couldn't find some that you probably wouldn't want in real life, because I agree, there's the fantasy piece. But the things that always kept me back from enjoying what I was exposed to, certainly not all, certainly not everybody. I know there is a much broader range out there than what I've read. But that was one of the things that brought me into male-male romance, was because you didn't have the tropes that pushed my buttons when I tried to read things in male-female romance. And that is something I've heard from a lot of other female readers of male-male romance.
And do you find that it's mostly women writing male-male romance? I mean, I know some males who are writing it too, obviously, but is that true?
There are certainly a lot of men who write male-male romance. There are probably more women who write male-male romance. And one of the biggest publishing houses, which has fallen on hard times, I'm not going to mention them, but it was originally started because the founder came downstairs one day and found her gay brother reading one of her male-female romance novels and said, "You're gay, why are you reading that?" And he said, "Because they don't write books for people like me." And Big Sister said, "Well, they do now." And she started a romance line, which I just think is tremendously loving. As I said, that particular line's fallen on some hard times, but I think that that's kind of an interesting beginning for one of the biggest lines that really brought male-male romance into the mainstream.
And is romance basically a type of escapism that people like to read because it's maybe they don't have romance in their own life, or am I reading too much into that?
I think it is escapism, but not necessarily for not having romance. I mean, I think there's a large proportion of people in relationships, people who are married, who read romance. I hear a lot, especially during quarantine times, that people just find a lot of comfort. I mean, that's not just, but that's the reason why people read romance. It's comforting because of the tropes, and they may seem like cliches if you're not a romance reader, but if that's what you're here for, you want to know there's going to be happily ever after. You want to know that nothing's too bad is going to happen. They're going to have struggles, and at the end, it's going to be happy and good and loving, and it's an escape from your day-to-day life and from the dreariness of whatever your problems are. And so that's why the tropes are advantageous. That's why we put them in there, and the readers want them, because they like the familiarity of knowing what to expect and knowing what they're going to get.
Yeah, I think that that's a big thing, is you know what you're getting when you pick up a romance novel. You are not going to be left high and dry at the end because everybody dies. And in that sense, it's like any other genre that you like to read. You have your mental checkbox. Wizards, check. Magic ring, check. Spellbook, check. Okay. Well, romance does the same thing. As far as, many of the romance writers that I know are married and have been for a long time. A lot of the romance readers that I know are married or in a relationship, have been for a long time, or with a partner. I will say that one thing in romance, both male-female and male-male, is that men have these amazing conversations where they talk about feelings and emotions freely and openly. It's kind of women-splaining.
That can be done? Really? You can do that?
And that is one other thing that I think comes up a lot in the male-male romance, is you have two people who may have been raised with toxic masculinity, so they're both fighting it and dealing with it, as opposed to one person trying to haul the other person out of it. So you have two people kind of calling each other on their crap, which is kind of interesting, because that plays into some of the more questionable tropes in traditional romance. So it kind of gets a different turn.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about how much physical description do you need to put in a romance? And at what point do you go from telling a romance to erotica? Is less more? I mean, it's a general question, I know, but and does it take, if you're writing something that's like a young adult romance, how much do you put in that sort of thing?
So it's personal preference. There's plenty of what they call sweet romance, or it can be sweet, inspirational. Inspirational tends to be more like Christian and religious, but also they just call sweet if there's no on the page sex. Closed door, you know, they either have closed door sex scenes or they don't even have sex. They just kiss. It's just very chaste. And there's Amish romance. There's anything you can think of. And all the way up to, you know, sex on the page for many chapters. You know, it can be extremely drawn out. It can be very quick. And it's really author preference and audience preference. Like, who are you writing for and what do they expect? And like I said, erotica is more of a niche. So you're longer, you're describing way more than in, you know, they call it the heat level. So you kind of measure heat level, whether it's low, medium, high, or super high. You know, there's just
I guess what you need to do first is find out who you want to sell it to, in terms of what an agent's going to want and what the publisher's going to want. You don't want to be sending a heavy, explicit story to one of those Christian publishers, for instance. So you know who your audience is in that sense. Since this is a group mostly of people who are writers and want to be writers, do you have any advice on where to go if you have a story? Publishers, agents, anything like that? Or where to find them, I guess I should say.
Can I chime in on the last question first?
Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
First point was, I grew up in an Amish area, so I'm not sure how people think Amish romance has no sex in it, because all the families I knew had like 8 kids, and they all looked like the parents, so somebody was doing something somewhere. But I think one of the guidelines I found early on when I started writing was a suggestion of 2 or 3 sex scenes max per book, which keeps the focus on the development of the characters and their relationship and whatever other plot is going on, and not, it's another chapter, let's jump into bed again, so that the sex doesn't get in the way of all the other things that are happening in the book. So I kind of keep that in mind. Mine tend to be still around a 4. So they get spicy, but and 1 or 2 that it didn't happen until the end, or there wasn't as much. Darned if the reviews went, well, there wasn't enough sex. Okay, well, noted. But I think as long as the emphasis is on the plot and the character development and the relationship development, and the sex flows naturally from that instead of kind of hijacking everybody's attention and the majority of the book, that keeps it out of the erotica category.
And the same publisher will publish multiple heat levels. You know, they can. So if an author, some people just don't feel comfortable writing the sex scenes. They want to write about the romance. So they'll write a closed door. And, you know, if it's just a regular publisher who's not like an erotica publisher or something, then there's room in the marketplace for that. And either the marketing will tell you, sometimes the marketing doesn't tell you, and you have to rely on the reviews. And, you know, if you're a reader who doesn't want to read the sex scenes, then you can find, you know, the authors who are not writing them, or who are writing lower heat levels and shorter, you know, less descriptive sex scenes.
And with male-male romance, since that one publisher has, you know, lost a lot of their authors and like I said, fallen onto hard times, a great amount of male-male romance is indie published and does very, very well. So, I mean, we've got one author who writes contemporary male-male romance, always indie, never was with a big press, and did over $1 million in royalties in 3 years. That's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind selling those kind of books. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question here about, we're talking about male romance, female romance. There's not much mention of female. Is there an audience for that or not?
It's out there. There are all kinds of pairings, and that's when you get into LGBTQ romance, there's non-binary, there's ace, there's aro, there's lesbian, there's thruples, there's all different kinds of combinations, just like there are all different kinds of combinations in the real world. So if you're looking for it, it's there.
I think that the female market is just smaller. Either the publishers aren't publishing as much, or the reading market is just smaller than the male market. That's what it seems to be.
It may also be that women will read about two men together. And, another piece of that is if there are two guys together, you're not comparing yourself to the female in the story going, is she younger? Is she prettier? Is she thinner? Is she, they're both two guys, and that's okay. But I don't think guys are as likely to read female romance. Read it. They may find the sex scenes interesting, but they aren't going to read the romance piece for the romance, since guys don't admit to reading romance, but we know that sometimes they do.
I've read a couple. Actually, I read a male one that was very good. I liked it a lot, but it wasn't heavy on the sex. But, I cared. I wanted these guys to get together, That's what you want when you read these things. Now, here's a good question. With romance, you have expectations for the genre, which means that sometimes if you're picking up a romance novel, you know where it's going to go. How do you break those expectations? How do you write a romance novel while still making it different and interesting from all the other romance novels when you know you have to end it with them together? Too broad of a question? Too general?
I think that's a good question. You have to find, because a romance reader is not going to be upset that it's going to end the same way that every other romance novel ends. That's why they're reading it. And so it's just, the characters and the situations and the conflicts are different. And like anything else, there's sort of levels. There's kind of like what I call like McDonald's romance, and then there's like Ruth's Chris or whatever fancy restaurant romance, where it's like just meatier and it delves into bigger issues and bigger conflicts. And then you've got like your Harlequins, and Harlequin is how many romance readers find the genre, but they're going to be like more of a fast food, casual dining type of meal, as opposed to something that's rich and hearty and that's dealing with weightier issues. So that's kind of the distinguishing factor to me. There can be romance with more meat on the bones that is really moving emotionally with the character development and the relationship development and dealing with issues that you would deal with in a literary fiction novel. It's just about people falling in love.
Yeah, I think romance is certainly a genre that has some expected beats in the story. Like we talked about the meet cute. We talked about, or the meeting at least has to be memorable, if not cute. Usually around the 80% point, there is some conflict that threatens to break the two people apart. And then the last 20% of the novel is them resolving that conflict, whether it's interpersonal or whether somebody's been kidnapped or whether the ship is sinking, whatever it is, something threatens them at about 80%. And there are some other, if you look at some of the books on how to write a romance and the beats idea, there are certain elements you can use in a formula. But when it comes to just storytelling, you try to come up with characters who aren't cardboard cutouts. They've got a backstory. They've got a reason for what they're doing. They've got hangups and hurts and scars, and there is some problem in their lives. And then you've got the plot. And so, I'm not busting on Hallmark Christmas movies here, because they are a balm to people's soul, and that's why they're running them again in July this year, because we all need it. Who wants to wait till December? Bring it on now. But once
you've seen one, you've seen them all. I mean, they're so predictable.
But they've proven that psychologically, and this is the same thing you get out of rewatching your favorite movie or re-binging your favorite show or your favorite book, is that predictability is comforting in an unstable world. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in real life, but we know that Frodo gets the ring to Mordor and all is well. And I think that that's very much alive and well in romance. So it's not the predictability, it's what you throw in with memorable characters and situations and settings.
And there are people who are taking the beats and the structure and the formula and, sort of shifting it. Like we talk about the 80%, we call it the black moment or the dark moment where something tears the characters apart. There are authors who are not really doing that. And I can think of several who, in different subgenres of romance, you've had enough conflict on getting together. So where you expect that to happen, and as a romance reader, you kind of expect it. And then when it doesn't happen, it's a little bit refreshing. It's like, oh, we didn't have to have that because it was really difficult at the 20% and the 30 and the 40. So now we're just letting, there's still tension on the page. And as a writer, every scene should have some sort of tension or conflict inherent in it, but you don't have to have that, the world exploded. So that's a way to keep it fresh and to sort of, go against the expectations that people might have. If you can do that well and still have an engaging story. There are other authors who don't have that black moment, but they don't do it well. And so it's like the last 20% is boring. It's like, what's happening? Why? I mean, they're together, they're happy, they're too happy. You can't be too happy for 20% of the book because you're bored. So it can be a fine line, but I think there are ways to tweak the structure that everyone knows. And most people love, but keeping that freshness there is possible.
So by our definition of romance, things like Romeo and Juliet would not be a romance because it doesn't have a happy ending. Titanic would not be a romance because it doesn't have a happy ending. And you guys might not be able to see this because of the recording, but they're both shaking their heads absolutely not. So they're agreeing that those are not romances. There's a question about culture. You mentioned Amish romance before. When writing different cultures, are there different expectations when you're writing about a different type of person than yourself, for instance? I know it's a broad question.
I think anytime you're writing about somebody who isn't you, you have to be very, very careful to do your research well, to have your beta readers from that culture or knowledgeable of that culture so that you are being correct and that you are accurate and that you are not in any way appropriating or misinterpreting or mispresenting things. It would be a boring world if we all only wrote about people exactly like us. So it's kind of inherent in writing that you write about people who aren't you. Writing about me would be really, really boring because I only sit there and write about other people. My life is not interesting. So I think good beta readers, good research, and knowing that when you're out of your home territory, that's when you need to make sure you are doing a lot of double checking and have good factual sources and people who know the situation advising you.
That's sort of what I was asking, but I was asking, is there a difference? I mean, if you read an Amish romance, how is it different from a New York couple romance? You see what I mean? Is there subcategories based on cultures out there in the romance novel categories?
I mean, there is multicultural, which kind of encompasses anything that's not white. I think African American on Amazon has its own designation. And I can't think of any. I think Asian American, there probably are ones for like Latino and the different, racial groups. But I mean, the good thing about, human beings falling in love, there's not that much difference in that. It's the external conflict that happens. And maybe your culture will influence the internal conflict. If it's like a story about an arranged marriage and you don't want to have an arranged marriage and you fall in love with someone who's not of that culture, those things are definitely influenced. So that all of those external factors, but falling in love is universal and love is universal.
Well, I think if you think about the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, she wrote about growing up in a Greek family, which she did. And everybody being a busybody in your life and trying to marry you off and pressuring you because you're not married yet. And just the whole big Greek family, which is very much of a subculture. Crazy Rich Asians, the movie. Again, it's something that if you came from that culture and experienced it, you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said that. Yeah, that's my aunt. That sort of thing. That takes a real great deal of knowledge to pull that off, to be on the inside of a culture. I don't know that much about the people who have written Amish romance. I mean, certainly people do leave the Amish. I have no idea whether that's true in those cases or not. Maybe they just do good research.
All right, well, we're got a little bit of time left, but not a huge amount of time. So I want to know if you guys have comments that you would like to make that I haven't asked you, that you think people would like to hear about when you want to write romance, or how you can sell it, or what publishers are looking for, agents, anything that you might want to give us that I didn't happen to ask a question about.
I don't know, that different publishers and agents are looking for different things. So it's, if you want to write something and you have this desire and in your heart to write something, you can probably find someone who's looking for something similar at least that you can pitch to. And self-publishing, I mean, for romance especially, self-publishing is huge. A lot of the traditional publishing imprints have actually closed, especially the digital first imprints. So there are still, trad publishers doing print in romance, but the market in romance readers are so voracious that ebooks and ebook publishing just works so much better because they're reading 4 or 5 books a week generally.
Well, what is the word count generally for a romance novel?
It can vary. I mean, anything from a novella to, Harlequin super romance is 100,000 words or something.
Or
like
Chuck
that.
Tingle, who does 40 pages, and that's what he calls a novel. Yes.
Yeah. So there's a market for short, like if you're writing erotica, short can sell, and you can sell very short stories for $2, $3, $4.99 if you're in indie publishing, all the way up to your $100,000 word romance.
Yeah, and for my romances, they tend to come in somewhere between 65,000 and 75,000 words. So around that 200, 225 page mark, which when you realize that my epic fantasies roll in at about 175,000 words and 630 pages, these go by really fast. I think, and this is true no matter what kind of writing you want to do, read a ton of what you think you want to write, because you'll absorb so much just from reading about the pacing and the tropes and the structure, and you'll see what you like and what you don't like and what you wish somebody would do differently, and I wonder if anybody did that. Just read hundreds of stories before you set out to write it, and that will make it so much easier in the long run, because that knowledge is in the back of your mind helping you craft your stories, because you've already seen what's out there. So, and that holds no matter what genre you're writing in.
Is it important to have romance in all your stories, or do people expect that, especially if you have 2 main characters? Do people normally expect them to get together? And the only reason I ask this is this: I had a criticism for one of my novels one time where they said, "Well, why didn't the 2 main characters get together? The woman and the man." And I went, "Because they're just friends. That's all they are. It's not a love story, And they expected it. And sometimes I felt like saying, well, since you expected it, I'm glad I didn't do it then, because I like breaking your expectations. Have you found that? Or is that just me?
A couple of series where I've said straight out, look, I'm never going to clarify what the romantic relationship is between these 2 characters, because it doesn't play into and this is on the Gail side of things, it's not important for the plot. We don't need to know that. So you can ship them or not ship them however you want. I'm okay with it, because it's never going to show up on page, because you don't need to know it.
For me, I'm really not interested in writing things that aren't romances, or they don't have a romance in them. When I read a book that doesn't have a romance, I'm always vaguely disappointed. Or I recently read an arc that was fabulous, but at the end, everybody died. And I was just like, this is not what I needed in my life right now. And I think I've gone through periods of reading, I went through a big literary period 20 years ago. And, now I'm in a period where I want the happily ever afters for the characters that I'm reading and that I'm writing. And so just as a personal choice, that's really all that I'm interested in writing right now. I don't see myself doing anything without a romance in it anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I was in my 20s, I went through this period where the more painful the book, the better, because pain meant I was alive. And I don't now in that phase, and they recommend things and I'm going, no, if I want to be in pain, I'll read the headlines. Give me something fluffy.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Carol has a question, and Carol is a writer who actually I've edited in a couple of anthologies, or in one anthology. She says she has an amateur sleuth novel that happens to have a romance in it, and was surprised when an agent looked at the first 10 pages and immediately dubbed it as romantic suspense, which she wasn't expecting that to happen. Is it a losing battle to just push it as a mystery, or is she better off trying to sell it as a romantic suspense?
It depends on the market. I could see the market being stronger for romantic suspense is big now. It sells a lot. So you might do better marketing it as a romantic suspense.
And I have also read cozy mystery series that gradually introduce a romance. Now, none of the cozies have on-screen violence, nor do they have on-screen sex. That's part of what makes them cozy. But eventually the amateur sleuth falls in love with the sheriff because they spend an awful lot of time together. And, they get together. So it's not, I don't think it's impossible to have it go either way. It's just, if you're going to go cozy mystery, you probably can't have the sex. If you want to go romantic suspense, you can.
And if you really want it to be a mystery, maybe find a different agent who doesn't, who wants it to be a mystery, like who doesn't do romance or something like that. Because agent perspective, they're going to be like, oh, I do this, I can see it as this, where maybe that agent doesn't know how to market or sell a mystery to an editor.
One last question someone has is, we said Titanic was not a romance. What is it?
I have to use nice words, right?
So I say that again?
I have to use nice words, right? Because there was room for both of them on that door. Let's just be real about this. I love you, get off my door.
It's not one of my favorite movies, no.
You can have a romantic subplot without it being a romance. So anytime there's not a happily ever after, and it looked like it was people falling in love, or people did fall in love, we just call that a romantic subplot. It does require that happy ending for it to be a romance in the romance Writers of America definition sense of it.
It just seems like the whole plot, the main plot of Titanic, the movie, was the romance, though. And so that's why you say it's not really an adventure story, because it's not really about the adventure. It's about the romance, but it's not a romantic movie. So that's why it's kind of hard to categorize.
It's a romantic movie. I think it is a romantic movie.
But it's not through romance. It's kind of like the Poseidon Adventure with romance. I mean, it's a disaster movie heightened by the fact that you care about two of the characters a great deal because you've seen them fall in love. But in the end, it's really kind of a disaster movie tragedy with romantic elements.
Right. Yeah. Romeo and Juliet, same way. You have, so romance is like the shelf at Barnes and Noble. Nothing on that shelf is going to have anything but a happy ending, So all of these other things with these really strong, beautiful romances, they're going on the fiction shelf. They're going on the literature shelf.
All right. Any last minute comments you want to give as we're running out of time? Either of you?
I think if you're interested in writing either romance or even just adding a romantic subplot, the Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes is a very short, very concise book. I think you don't have to read the book. There's like worksheets floating around the internet that give you the beats, Romancing the Beat. So it's the beats of the romance storyline. And if you are struggling with a romance storyline, that's very helpful.
And that's exactly the book I would have recommended. So yes, say it's a great book if you want to write romance.
Okay, so in the last few seconds, I'd like each of you to tell us where we can find you, your webpage, what you're working on, what we can look for next.
My website is lpenelope.com, and all of my social links are there. The third book in my Earth Singer Chronicle series is Cry of Metal and Bone, and it comes out August 11th. So third book of a 4-book series.
And my websites are gailzmartin.com for the non-romance, morganbryce.com for the romance. Kings of the Mountain is the newest release, which if you think of mashing up Supernatural and Dukes of Hazzard, only the two main characters are together, you've got it. And the new one coming out is Huntsman. It's the first in the Fox Hollow series. And that is Shifter Romance in the Adirondacks.
All right, well, I thank everyone for coming. We're going to stop the recording now, but please stick around. Thank you, everyone.